Pleased to introduce Dr. Emily Lindsey, who is our new, still I think of as new, curator at the Page Museum that are known as the Tar Pits on Wilshire Boulevard. And she comes to us from history, well, most recently, I guess, Berkeley, where she was a postdoc, but before that, she got her PhD at Berkeley, and before that, she got her bachelor's degree at Brown. Then she did a Fulbright, you were a Fulbright scholar in Uruguay, and then a postdoctoral scholar at Berkeley, as I already said. And she's done field work in a variety of places, including Antarctica. I don't think that was paleo, that was, in an earlier life of marine biology sorts of things. She's done field work in Antarctica, Guyana, Ecuador, Chile, and the United States. Her specialty is actually, her PhD was on tar seep deposits in South America. And she is currently, in addition to being the curator, she has a position here in the IOES as adjunct assistant professor, I guess, and also at Earth Sciences at USC. She's an adjunct. So her specialty is the Pleistocene, the ice ages, climate change, the impacts of climate change and the arrival of humans and the expansion of humans on extinction events potentially, and also the relevance of studying the past to the present and the future, as we are in this age of global warming. And so today she will speak to us on that, on biotic responses to global change with her paleontological perspective.
Great. Thanks, Blair. And thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here and to be hosted by such an illustrious paleontologist that I've, respected for my entire academic career and known for many years. So it's exciting to be here speaking in your department and also to be faculty here at UCLA now. So as Blair said, and as it says right there, I'm at the Tar Pits, which means this is what I study, is what the world in general and now Los Angeles in particular looked like going back from about 10,000 years ago, going backwards for any number of thousands or even in some cases millions of years. My questions basically revolve around several points. First of all, just understanding these ecosystems. What were they like? How did the changes in the environment as well as human actions intersect to cause the drastic change in ecosystem structure that we saw going from the Pleistocene into the Holocene? That's the loss of about 75% of the large mammals in North America, which was reflected globally as well. What factors can help predict the survival or extinction of species across this time period and in the face of these types of pressures? What were the effects of these extinctions? There's been many decades of debate over the causes of these extinctions, but people are now starting to look also at what's known as defaunation. So what happens when you take most of the large animals out of an ecosystem? What types of impacts does that have on the rest of the ecosystem? And then finally, as Blair mentioned, how can the answers to these first questions be used to actually help inform conservation practices today? And this fifth question has been sort of an increasing degree of interest in the ecological and paleoecological communities, because we're starting to recognize that a lot of questions that people are asking in modern conservation biology can really be substantially informed by the deeper time paleobiological records. So for instance, how do species respond, or how can they be predicted to respond to climate change? Well, if we look to the past, we can actually look at trajectories over which plants and animals have migrated in the face of past climate changes, how they've changed their biology, which ones have been most susceptible to extinction or massive population restrictions in the face of climate change. How have things repasted to past anthropogenic disturbance as well? So Blair and Bob and I, and maybe some of you saw a talk by Dr. Sue Kidwell this weekend on this project, which was looking at the shallow paleontological record of Santa Monica Bay and comparing live dead assemblages to look at what the base of Santa Monica Bay may have looked like before the onset of substantial human modification of the terrestrial landscape. What are the effects of introducing or removing species from an ecosystem? So there's a lot of focus on introduced species, and that's been the case for, over a decade now, but there's sort of an increasing focus now also on the effect of removing species, this concept I mentioned of defaunation, where the biggest species removal experiment we can really look to in recent time is this loss of large mammals from the landscape. And we know from modern experiments, natural or otherwise, in Africa, when you take elephants and wildebeest, these large ecosystem engineers, out of an ecosystem, you see a substantial transition from open savanna grassland to like dense shrubby brushy forest in a pretty short span of time. And so can we see these types of effects in the paleontological record? What precipitates them and how long do they persist? Understanding ecosystem baselines, and a lot of the ecological and conservation science people are looking at restoring to some sort of baseline ecosystem. A lot of times those baselines are set with pretty shallow time understandings, maybe European arrival or maybe industrialization. And so if we look to the paleobiological record, that can sometimes help inform these types of practices. So these are just a few examples. So Blair and I were just talking about Yellowstone. Well, there was a big debate about the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone, and one of the arguments people were making was that wolves had never been year-long inhabitants of Yellowstone National Park, and it was actually paleontological data from some of Liz Hadley's research that demonstrated that they actually had been, year-round inhabitants of the park prior to extirpation, and so that was some evidence in favor of the reintroduction. This one at the top was kind of a funny story from the Galapagos Islands. The scientists, conservation biologists, were working hard to eradicate introduced plants. There's a huge problem with invasive species on islands, and the Galapagos are arguably the most important set of islands for a number of scientific reasons, and so they were working very hard to eradicate invasive species and specifically certain plants, and they were having a really hard time getting rid of a few species of plants. And then paleobiological data from coring actually demonstrated that, well, those plants were really good at living there because they were actually native plants. They weren't invasive plants. They were actually native to the Galapagos Islands. Also looking not just at species that have historically inhabited ecosystems, but what historic ecosystem function is like. So this was from an interesting study. There's sort of been a parlance, certainly when I was, young and in college, at least, that, well, the chaparral forest, it used to be extensively sort of intentionally burned by indigenous groups, and then maybe our suppression of fire was leading to these really large forest fires. And these guys did a study, and they found that actually there was no difference across 3 different types of fire management regimes, from intentional burning to hands-off to fire suppression in the intensity of the forest fires. And that was actually driven by climate variables and not really by human intervention at all. So paleobiological data can reveal a lot of things to us that we don't necessarily see in this short time frame that we're looking at an ecosystem on the modern landscape. And then finally, again, an interest of mine, what types of factors correlate with the ability of a species to survive major episodes of perturbation? So there's one project that we're currently working on at the tar pits, trying to reconstruct ancient food webs from based on the fossils that are represented in these deposits, and trying to determine whether different factors of the topology of these food webs, the number of species, the number of interactions, the strength of interactions, the diversity, correlate with food web stability across periods of ecological perturbation. And the tar pits are a great place to ask all of these questions, specifically because of this, because we have just vast, unimaginable quantities of paleontological data in one place, in one geographic location spanning tens of thousands of years. And not only do we have vast numbers of particular species, but we have a really broad array of different types of paleontological data that you don't find in pretty much any other type of paleontological deposit anywhere. So it is very, very unusual, for instance, to get plant material and bone preserved in the same types of paleontological deposits, because the type of sediments that dissolve one, or that preserve one, tend to dissolve the other, and vice versa. It's also pretty unusual to get really large material associated with very small material, because the taphonomic pathways to preservation tend to be very different. You might find a lot of large bones in bone beds where the smaller material has been washed away in a fluvial setting. And you might find a lot of small material in wood rat middens or raptor middens, but then you're not getting the larger material. The tar pits has all of it. We also have soft tissues and proteins that allow us to do radiocarbon dating and stable isotope analyses that wouldn't necessarily be possible otherwise. And again, this, not only do we have essentially an entire ecosystem represented at the tar pits, but it's an ecosystem covering a very specific point in our recent geological history. It's the last major episode of global climate change. It's the arrival and expansion of humans on the North American continent, and it's the disappearance of about 75% of the large mammals from this ecosystem. And so if, as conservation biologists, we want to ask questions about what are the long-term impacts of climate change, human activity, and defaunation on an ecosystem, this is probably one of the best places in the world, if not the best place in the world, to do it. Also, because it's in the middle of the third biggest city in North America, it was discovered over 100 years ago and has been more or less continuously excavated and studied since then. We have millions of specimens covering over 600 different species of plants and animals. And it's an area of not only continuously high, but ever increasing scientific interest. So it's a great place to leverage for these types of studies. But I'm actually mostly not going to talk about the tar pits today. I just like to plug them every chance I get because they're great. And I'll circle back to them at the end. So going back to this extinction event, which is sort of my major research program, we are living, and again, you wouldn't know this if you weren't looking at the paleontological record, but we're living in an incredibly biologically impoverished world. These silhouettes here on the left of the screen represent large mammal taxa, that's mammals weighing more than 100 pounds, that were living in North America at the end of the last ice age. And these green ones on the bottom are the ones that are still alive today. This is just 15,000 years ago, right? And this is a pattern that held true not just in North America, but also in South America, in Eurasia, northern Eurasia, Australia, basically everywhere except for Africa, which is the only ice-free continent on Earth that still retains what could be considered a natural biological mammalian ecosystem in terms of body size distribution. And this event is important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it represented a real departure from what ecosystems had looked like, terrestrial ecosystems had looked like on this planet for about the last 50 million years, but in terms of diversity and in terms of body size. And it's also important because it very likely represents the beginning of the biodiversity crisis that we find ourselves in today. So this is a study that a bunch of us did a number of years ago, trying to quantitatively assess whether or not we're in something called the sixth mass extinction, which is a term that's thrown around increasingly in the conservation sphere. And what we determined is that, well, if you look at rates of, sort of plausible rates of extinction across different time periods, we're up there, but we're not necessarily outside the realm of natural variability over the past 50 plus million years, unless you include the Pleistocene. When you include the Pleistocene, you start to get out of it. And then if you make the assumption that all species that are now threatened or endangered go extinct, then we're way outside any plausible realm of natural variability and approaching something that might very well be considered a mass extinction, as defined as the loss of 75% of biodiversity or greater. Now this event, which is referred to as the Ice Age extinctions, the late Quaternary extinctions, the Pleistocene extinctions, has been a focus of intense debate for about 70 years now. And specifically, the debate has focused on what caused these extinctions. And was it mostly humans or was it mostly climate? Because two things were happening at the time when most of these animals went extinct. First of all, we were coming out of the last ice age, so there was a substantial amount of climate variability. There was rapid warming, there was the Younger Dryas, there was rapid warming again. And the other thing that was happening was humans were spreading out across the world. And so a lot of studies have focused on, first of all, choosing one culprit for these extinctions, and second of all, figuring out how they varied by continent. Well, in Australia, it was sort of clearly humans, but in Europe, it was sort of mostly climate. We don't really know in South America. And this level of debate has continued for a very, very long time. And I ended up getting a little bit perplexed by it because we know that that's not how extinctions work today, right? Like, we know that today climate and humans are intersecting to drive extinctions. And not only that, but they're not doing it like at once across a continent. They're divided up at various regional scales. Mountains are being impacted differently from deserts, and forests are being impacted differently from coastlines. And so, a bunch of us started talking and saying, well, why don't we look at this last major extinction event from that perspective, and this understanding that, in the real world, complex pressures intersect to drive extinction trajectories through time and space. And so in order to understand this past extinction event, and in order for that event to be useful in any way for modern conservation work, we really need to look at it from this more complicated and realistic perspective. So the research that I'm going to present going forward is the result of this now multi-year, about 5-year NSF-funded project led by my former advisor, Tony Barnowski, along with me, Charles Marshall, director of the UC Museum of Paleontology, my colleague, Dr. Natalia Villavicencio, who's now a postdoc in Chile, and Tom Stafford, who's a radiocarbon dating expert, as well as about 30 other North and South American paleontologists, archaeologists, and paleoclimatologists. And we set about to start looking at extinctions, specifically extinctions in South America, from a regional perspective, and then seeing if we were able to integrate this regional understanding across the landscape, and if we could learn anything new about the extinctions from that. So I'll give a couple of case studies. So we looked at the Pampas, for instance. So the Pampas region has the most paleontological data in South America because it has decent preservation. It's also right around Buenos Aires, where most of South America's paleontologists happen to be. So there's been a lot of study there. It's a grassland, and it's the climate in South America, this is taken from an Antarctic ice core record, but basically followed this trajectory. It was pretty cold until about 18,000 years ago. It started warming up. It had a cold reversal analogous to, but slightly chronologically offset from the Younger Dryas, and then warmed again into the Holocene. And at first glance, most of the extinctions appeared to take place in this later warming phase, or at the end of this later warming phase. We assembled a bunch of pollen records from the pampas and determined that, well, because it's an ecotonal ecosystem, you have sort of, drier kind of woodland transitioning to grassland in the south, and wetter sort of subtropical climate in the north. And I don't know, is Lauren here? Yeah, so Lauren called me out on this. So dry grasslands, which happen to be C3 dominated, even though that's not traditionally related to dry, transitioning to humid grasslands, which happen to be C4 dominated, but even though that's not traditionally associated with wet. Is that okay? Seemed to have been the transition that this area underwent. But fundamentally, it was basically a grassland, and remained one. We also have a really great archaeological record in the Pampas for the same reason that we have the good paleontological record. There's a lot of archaeologists down there. And we have really early records of human occupation and really early records of actually humans directly impacting megafauna population in the Pampas. So the humans show up early. There seems to be a population spike around 8,000 years ago. And then it gets low again, and then a large increase in population later on towards the later Holocene. So what we did was we've assembled a really quite large database of radiocarbon dates at this point, several hundred radiocarbon dates, including 90 or so new dates that we ran using very sort of the most high-level radiocarbon techniques using amino acids to date. So we feel really confident that those are precise. And we threw out a ton of dates that we didn't really trust for one reason or another. Either they were run on inappropriate materials, they had extremely low sample sizes, there were questions about contamination. So we did a huge amount of vetting of dates too. And actually, this is a slightly older slide. A couple of those youngest dates will be thrown out, but it doesn't really change the results. And so, so we looked at dates on a number of different megafauna species. We calculated sort of estimated last appearance times based on using this method that takes into account both the number and spacing of dates. Because of course you're not really going to get the very last animal on the landscape when you date a fossil unless you're really, really lucky. And then we use these inferred extinction times to compare against ecological and human changes. And so what we found was kind of interesting. There appear to be sort of species-specific responses. So in some of these weird South American notoungulate groups seem to go extinct pretty soon, and in the case of the Pampas, right after the arrival of humans. Meanwhile, horses and extinct llama species, the ungulates, appear to disappear right in the middle of this ecological transition, even though it wasn't a seemingly, a huge landscape level transformation. It does appear to be related to that, at least chronologically. And then these xenarthrans, which I've never been able to figure out that this is a pattern across the continent, I'll show you later, seem to persist quite long and seem to overlap with humans for several thousands of years, and also don't appear to be particularly affected by the climate changes that are happening, which is interesting. Although, at least in the Pampas, their disappearance does appear to coincide very closely with this inferred uptick in human population. And so if we were to then make assumptions based on this about what might have driven these fauna to extinction, we might come up with different factors impacting different animals differently. So the toxodons may be a very abrupt disappearance in relation to human impacts. Like maybe they were slow and tasty and not very many of them, and so they went extinct right away. Maybe the equids and llamas maybe had some sort of response to the climate or environmental changes that were happening. And then the xenarthran taxa, maybe it was more of a slow attritional decrease in population related to human actions. We did the same thing in Patagonia, and came up with really quite a similar sort of trajectory. In this case, we had enough carnivores to investigate, and these guys were the ones that went extinct really soon after humans arrived. Again, we have the disappearance of the horses and llamas coinciding really closely with climate changes. And in this case, there was much more of a notable change on the landscape related to the climate, where you go from an open grassland to a closed nothofagus forest across that transition. And again, these darn giant sloths, who'd have thunk it, they stick around for a really long time. And that was, sort of a surprising thing, because you'd think if humans were going to eat anything, it would be like these giant, slow-moving things. Although I will say, at least certainly in Patagonia, the species had a bunch of armor in its skin, and they all have these really giant claws. So there may have been some reason that humans weren't going after them. We also developed a model, very simple nonlinear regression, to try to analyze whether there was a synergistic interaction between the disappearance of the megafauna, synergistic interaction between humans and climate in relation to the disappearance of the megafauna. So an example of synergy on the modern landscape would be in national parks in Africa today. You have a lot of species that aren't going to be able to live there anymore under predicted climate regimes. Now, normally in the past, these animals would just migrate to a new location where the climate and the vegetation is more suitable, but they can't do that now because there are cities and highways and farmers who want to shoot them for trampling their crops, and it's very, very dangerous, and the only way that those species are going to survive is if we put them in trucks and drive them to a new location. That's an example of synergy, where they could have responded to the human impacts by staying out of the way of humans. They could have responded to the climate just by moving, but when you have those two factors intersecting, they're not able to do it. So, so we're wondering, could a similar thing have happened in the past? Was there an example? Because the places on Earth where we seem to see the most extinctions happening the quickest across this extinction period are the areas where you have intersecting humans and climate change. And so we were trying to quantitatively assess on both a continental and a regional scale, could that have been a driver in making exacerbating these extinctions? This is some new data that I just analyzed last week, and the initial results are kind of interesting. So we divided South America into a number of different regions, and then we analyzed each region to see whether climate, humans, or a synergistic effect were associated with these extinctions, and when the extinctions happened. And what we noticed were, for these two regions, Patagonia and the Andes, the extinctions appeared to be earlier, and they appeared to coincide with climate changes. And if I was going to tell a story about that, I would say that makes a lot of sense, because these are two areas that are most likely to be impacted sort of most dramatically by climate change, because it's the high latitude and high altitude regions. We know that, again, from that Patagonia study I just showed you, there was a substantial ecological turnover there across that climate transition, where when it gets warmer, it also gets wetter, and you get a wholesale transition from open grassland to nothofagus forest. So it makes sense that that would have some impact on a landscape scale. There's also been really local site scale studies coming out of the Andes. There was one in Ecology a year or two ago, where they looked at, they were able to demonstrate that for this, based on evidence from this one site, this particular area of the Andes appeared to lose all of the megafauna from there. And this is a Sporomyella study. Sporomyella is a fungus that grows on the dung of large animals and is used sometimes as a proxy for either extinction or population crashes in this megafaunal extinction event. And they found that the Sporomyella disappeared from the record, coinciding with these climate changes and changes in the vegetation in this region of the Andes, and before any evidence of human presence. And so it looks like there may have been regions where at least some species of megafauna were extirpated from before humans even arrived on the landscape, and in concert with these late Pleistocene and Ice Age climate transitions. On the other hand, extinctions in the Pampas region and also coastal Brazil appeared to happen later. Again, the climate data from the Pampas indicates that there wasn't as dramatic of a vegetation shift happening there. And the only region that at a regional scale showed evidence of human climate synergy was here in the Pampas as well, which is interesting. So there may have been, not enough of a change in vegetation or landscape to drive fauna from the region completely, but when that was happening at the same time that human population was increasing, that may have, those two impacts may have worked together to extirpate animals. And the other thing was it sort of confirmed this pattern that we'd seen in these two regional studies, where we see certain taxa appear to disappear earlier and other taxa appear to disappear later, namely these northlands, these giant sloths and armadillos. And that was both on a continental and multiple regional scales. And then the other thing we looked at was this question of defaunation. And so and this is a question, the question we were asking was, when you see the disappearance of these very large animals that could be inferred to be kind of mega herbivore ecosystem engineers, do you see a transition in the vegetation that would not be predicted by what was going on with the climate? And we looked at several different sites. Again, we used these records from the Pampas and Patagonia that were pretty good, and also looked at published literature from the Yukon area, California and the Pacific Northwest, and the northeastern United States. And interestingly, what we found was researchers had found defaunation signals at all three of these North American locations, and we didn't find a signal at either of these South American locations. And I'm not, I don't believe that is a North America versus South America thing. I think that these two particular sites, we didn't see defaunation for, or say a climate or vegetation response to defaunation for a couple of specific regions. Again, in the Pampas, it's a grassland, it sort of stayed a grassland. The types of plants that would exhibit a response to the loss of these mega herbivores, like gomphotheres that we had in that region, never disperse there or can't grow there or something, and so there wasn't any plant to respond. In Patagonia, on the other hand, we did have plant change, but we didn't have any mega herbivores that would have been drastically impacting those plants. There's no gomphotheres down there, and most of the large animals appear to be more grazers than browsers, and so wouldn't have had that much of an impact on the landscape. So, going back to this question of how can these types of studies be used to inform conservation efforts. So last year, a bunch of colleagues and I published this paper looking at how deeper time data from paleontology can be used to inform conservation decisions. And we basically divided conservation goals into two types. Either you're trying to restore to a previous ecosystem, in which case a lot of the data that I showed at the beginning would be useful. What species used to be there, and how did they interact, and what was the cycle like? Now that is possible in some contexts, but getting increasingly hard in the context of modern global change. So, and this is really problematic from sort of a policy and management standpoint. So for instance, the Leopold Report, which is the founding document of the National Park Service, states that Yellowstone National Park should be maintained to look like it did when white people first got there. And that's problematic on a couple of levels. First of all, when white people first got there, that was a landscape that had been intensively managed by people for thousands of years. And second of all, in the context of climate change, that's not actually possible. And a lot of these landscapes that we view as iconic and something that we want to preserve in a certain way, and I even have names based on certain either species or attributes that they have, may cease to exist. So there may not be Joshua trees in Joshua Tree National Park in 100 years. There may not be glaciers in Glacier National Park in 100 years. And so how can we use this deeper time understanding of variability and ecology in order to help guide management priorities, not just management practices of, what species do you leave, what do you take, but actual priorities going forward. And so in the context of understanding and accepting that there are going to be novel ecosystems on the landscape, what are the goals of those ecosystems from a conservation standpoint? And we basically ended up breaking it into three non-exclusive, somewhat overlapping, but also individual goals. So there's the goal of maximizing biodiversity. There's the goal of, we use the term mimic historical ecosystem structure and function, but that's basically saying have a place that feels like wilderness, right? Where you go there and you feel like you're in the wilderness. And finally, maximizing ecosystem services. And these can be done, you can hit all three of these by preserving vast swaths of the Amazon. But you can hit one or two of these in ways that don't meet the third one, right? So you can maximize biodiversity in a zoo. You can maximize ecosystem services with a monoculture crop that's really good at carbon fixation. And you can mimic historical ecosystem structure and function in a with far less biodiversity than it might have had originally. And so going forward, we're starting to look at, okay, so how do you take this deeper time data and integrate it into kind of guiding these policies? And that's a big reason why I wanted to have a joint appointment with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, because before I moved down here, I had started collaborating with people at Berkeley in the law school, in the National Park Service, in conservation biology and archaeology, looking at how do we actually take this information then and put it into practice? What does applied conservation paleobiology look like? And so that's something that I'm starting to kind of develop relationships and partnerships with here, and working with local conservation organizations, and going to start probably working with students in the environmental science practicum here as well. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to talk to people if anyone has any questions.
Some questions?
Well,
I guess a problem with moving from the approach of just restoring what was there to some historical baseline is, and then substituting that for ecosystem functions or something like that, is that it's a slippery slope, right? I mean, as the habitat continues to degrade, you'll degrade the criteria of ecosystem function. And so the taxa are definable, right? And so you know what they are. And so putting them back in the environment is a very definable baseline, whereas ecosystem function is not.
To some extent, yeah, but that's why you need to. I mean, in some cases you can do that, and in some cases you can't, because the taxa are extinct, or they're going to be extinct, or they can't live where they used to live, and so, some of the researchers we work with take like an ecometric approach, and they say, okay, well, we're not going to end up with this exact same species, but we can end up with, but we know what like the average leaf margin index was, or we know what the average cursoriality index was, or the average tail length of snakes, or whatever. And so we can reconstruct that ecosystem using taxa that have similar traits and interact in that with the landscape and the environment similarly, even if they're not the same species. And if you look at, over say a 30 million year time scale, you do sometimes see, while you have extinctions and introductions and evolutions of species, you often see a maintenance of sort of the average ecometric traits in certain taxa. So like you have maybe, you have a certain percentage of large carnivores, you have a certain percentage of cursorial mid-sized taxa, you have a certain percentage of small burrowing omnivores. And so some research that colleagues of mine have worked on has indicated that, in some areas, at least in North America and probably elsewhere, you do see kind of a maintenance of that sort of overall granular structure at the multi-million year time scale. And if it's maintainable over periods like the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, maybe it's also maintainable over periods like modern global change.
But I think this concern is the Yellowstone, the introduction of gray wolves is a great example, because the gray wolves could be introduced because they are protected under the Endangered Species Act, which is a taxon-specific
Right,
act.
yes.
And so they were put in place, and they restored, the trophic cascade, restored the habitat to some extent. But people living in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem argue humans could do the same thing, right? We could kill a third of the bison every year that roam off Yellowstone. We could. There's plenty of hunting camps where they shoot elk and are mad that the gray wolves are taking away the elk. So this is what I'm worried is that maintaining the ecosystem processes, in this case controlling the prey, and large ungulates will be taken over, say, by humans or some sort of non-natural process.
Yeah, I think that's a valid concern. People who are looking at it from a scientific perspective would say, well, the types of elk that are being taken by the wolves are maintaining the elk population at a very different, that looks very different than if you're letting hunters go in and shoot all the big males, right? And we've seen that happen before.
Yeah, and hunters stay near roads and they hunt seasonally, and it has a very different impact on the ecosystem than a natural predator like a wolf. So I think we could combat that with data.
Right, and scientists
change their hunting practices too.
Well, but we're not going to let them go out all year round and shoot in the national park, so that's not going to happen. There's another question.
Yeah, I just thought I'd like to get back to the variation in taxon extinction date and how that might relate to taxon properties or behaviors or supplements to human populations. In other words.
Yes.
So it just seems like you have these things that are big and slow, surviving longer.
Right.
Does that mean something about interactions, or those taxa not needing to say go to water or whatever that might be informative?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's one reason we're partnering with archaeologists on this, is because for a long time in the extinction debate in the paleontological community, the cultural factor has been completely ignored. It's like, humans, there's this assumption of optimal foraging strategy, right, on the part of humans, and it doesn't actually work that way. Like, humans have cultural reasons for not eating certain things, like, throughout history. And so we don't know about that. We do know that, we are able to look at ecological traits of species. So there's been a number of papers out looking at, correlates that have to do with body size, right, and slow reproductive rate or low numbers of, how many offspring do you have, how often do you have them, what's the litter size, how quickly do they wean, all of these things, and there do seem to be correlations with that. In terms of, like, do you go extinct or not? But when you start breaking it down and looking at these different factors, I think there are, it's a lot more complex than you can get at just looking at something on a continental scale.
Maybe begs the question, or I think so. The ground sloths up here in North America did not persist. Is there any evidence that they persisted for longer? I thought they pretty much went out with everybody else.
Well, I mean, so that's, people haven't really done species-specific extinction except for a couple of species here in North America. I mean, people have looked at mammoths. People have looked a little bit at sloths in like a global, a Pan-American context. But, and again, people have never broken it down regionally, not even in North America, really. And so that's something, that's what, we started in South America because that's where we were working and it had the least data and we wanted to sort of increase the number of radiocarbon dates in South America. But, the next step, one of my postdocs and I are starting to work on now is transferring this to North America and let's say, okay, well, the sort of southwestern North America region, like what's the regional pattern there? How does that compare? Because again, you see this pattern where we know that the Yukon now, based on a bunch of sort of intensive redating effort that Grant Zuzula has been working on, we know that a lot of the megafauna disappeared from there in concert with late Pleistocene climate change and before humans got there. We know that's also true for the Willamette Valley of Oregon. And so probably you are also going to see this patchwork extinction where you have these climate changes are starting to fragment these formerly intact populations, and then you have this novel, very efficient predator coming on the landscape that's going to impact certain species first. There's also been this idea, going back to the cultural thing, that humans, in order to cause the extinctions, people, the climate camp will argue, well, these small bands of itinerant hunters couldn't possibly have driven all the mammoths to extinction. But you don't actually have to go out and like hunt down every last mammoth to drive them to extinction. You just have to kill slightly more than are being born every year. And if you do that, it only takes a few hundred years in the models people run, or maybe a couple of thousand, to cause the population to collapse. Yeah.
So I always wondered why Africa is so different. And I was just, it dawned on me sitting here that could human perturbations such as fire actually have a buffering effect to actually allow certain species to persist where they wouldn't otherwise under climate?
So yeah, and that's interesting, and I didn't talk about that that data. I wasn't sure how long this talk would run. In the Patagonia study, when we did the quantitative analysis, let me see if I can go back to that. I don't know. The quantitative analysis in Patagonia. We actually found evidence of negative synergy in several different cases, where depending on what metric we were using for proxy for climate change and how we were quantifying sort of human population growth, there were areas where it seemed like when humans and climate change intersected, there were fewer extinctions than would have been predicted by each of them acting independently. And that was super perplexing for us. We're like, that is the opposite of like what we thought. But we thought about it and we're like, maybe, as you say, maybe if humans are setting fires, they're preventing this encroachment of forests on the landscape. Or alternatively, maybe if habitat is changing and creating more forest, maybe it's harder to hunt the megafauna if they're hiding behind the trees. So it opened up this whole other realm that we hadn't even thought about and just like today, humans, we have the ability to sort of work to mitigate the effects of climate change too for species. And so it was something we hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, you look at deer populations in Wisconsin. There are many more deer now than there were because of landscape change by humans.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I mean, we have a huge increase in biodiversity when you get, introduced species come in, at least for a short period of time, right?
Yeah.
Brad?
Which just, you're sort of dancing around, I think, the rewilding, migration issue, but it's clearly right there in front of the center.
Right.
And what is your take on that? You look at introduced, now wild ungulates in Texas, and which are all over the place in Central Texas. It's clear it works. It's clear it can work. We can get those species, happily marching around in our habitats. Pro or con?
Yeah, well, it's a sliding scale, right? So one of the postdocs at the Tar Pits is actually working with a group right now that's looking at the rewilding of grizzly bears into California. It's on our state flag, and yet hasn't lived in California for over 100 years. So, and so they're looking. What's that?
What about African elephants?
He wants you to get.
Oh, you want me to go even further? Well, I was starting with like the easier, the more digestible one. Then we can go on. But my point to that is that they're using paleontological data to do it, right? Like you wouldn't want to just say like, oh, there used to be elephanty things here. Let's put some elephanty things back and see what happens, right? So you want to look at what was the ecosystem actually like? What were those elephants eating? How were they interacting with the other species? When they went away, what happened to the other species? How does that impact our understanding of what a native ecosystem looks like? I think there are places where it's probably a good idea, but I think you really need to get the data, and you really cannot answer that question without deeper time data, and you need to dig into that first. And so that's what they're doing with the grizzly reintroduction is she's gone and like tracked down every single California grizzly in any museum anywhere and like run the isotopes on it. And we're looking at also pre-human bear interactions. The La Brea Tar Pits is one of only 2 places in California, maybe in the United States, where you get black bear and grizzly bear and short-faced bear in the same ecosystem. So how are different carnivores interacting? Now, to go a step further than you're going, are you also asking about de-extinction?
I think that's further down the line. I mean, philosophically, it's part of the same argument in many ways. Technically, it's along a different axis. But, I mean, sure, I think if one philosophically decides that moving things across space at large scales makes sense, then sort of moving across complexes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, things are complex. Like I know you were hosting Sue Kidwell's talk, right? And that story she gave about San Francisco Bay and like all of the things that happened with. This was in the panel discussion section where you had, the shell beds that were eradicated, but then the introduced shellfish cleaned up the bay, but then the crab wiped them out, but then so you just Nature is always going to have surprises for you, and if you're going to do something really drastic, like put elephants in Kansas, you probably, you want to have as much data under your belt before you do that as you can.
Sure. Although at the end of the day,
right. Yeah.
And that's sort of what
Yeah. Well, and again, I mean, there's smaller scale things too, like, reintroduction of gopher tortoises, right? That had been sort of pushed down to Mexico, but now they're being reintroduced. Or,
Do you have a question? Just had a small comment on your deer. While we're talking, obviously, in bigger time scales here with your stuff, and by the way, awesome. I have never seen a talk on this kind of stuff before, so it's all new for me, so I'm very excited about it. But it's also important to take into context of the deer is, and I don't know if the same happened in Wisconsin, but in Illinois, we actually drove our deer populations to 0. They were reintroduced by private herd. So while you can say now, you can look out on the landscape and trust me, I mean, you can't barely go a mile over the winter without finding a carcass. It's important to understand that back in the 30s, they were almost completely gone, and through these introductions, we put them back onto the landscape. And at around that same time, we were also having cultural changes, which you were getting at, that we don't often include these things in here. And within those cultural practices, we have a reduction of people hunting. So you have other things besides the landscape change, which was actually the current landscape doesn't really play to them that well because it is more open. And yes, they love the corn, but they, at also around that same time, we were taking out into the 60s and 70s, we were taking out all of the hedgerows, which where they would live. So now they live in smaller reserves, and they come out onto the landscape and eat the hell out of the corn because everyone off, they were in the car, and no one eats
Right. Yeah, and that's where historical ecologists are really important. And I hope that, there's thoughts about potentially hiring one at the Natural History Museum, which is our parent institution, because, to bridge that sort of gap between like modern conservation biology and paleobiology sort of / archaeology. I mean, we have, people who look at sort of historic or prehistoric land use by indigenous peoples in the area, and resource use and how that impacted things. Like Tom Wake here is a great professor who works on that. But then having somebody who, understands this historical context that you're talking about, that's not going to get picked up by an archaeologist. It's definitely not going to get picked up by me, and it probably wouldn't get picked up by a modern, conservation biologist, who's looking back the last 10 years and forward the next 50 years, right? So I think that's a great example.
One more question? Comment? Okay, thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks.